The shot did not echo the way Harlem expected it to. It cracked once, sharp, final, and then the night folded inward, swallowing the sound like it had swallowed so many secrets before. On 135th Street, a man staggered backward under a flickering street lamp, eyes wide with a disbelief that came too late. His knees buckled. His body met the pavement with a dull, humiliating thud. And just like that, trust died in Bumpy Johnson's world. For a half-second, no one moved. Men who had survived knife fights, prison yards, and police batons stood frozen as if time itself had been ordered to halt. A woman leaned out of a tenement window and screamed. Somewhere down the block, a radio kept playing jazz, bright, oblivious, cruel in its cheer. Bumpy Johnson did not reach for a gun. He did not shout. He did not run.
He stood there beneath the streetlight, coat buttoned high against the cold, eyes fixed on the body bleeding into Harlem concrete. The man on the ground had been family, not by blood, but by oath. A man trusted with money, roots, names, and silence. A man who should never have been lying dead at Bumpy's feet. The shooter lowered the pistol slowly. His hand was steady, but his breathing was not. He did not look at Bumpy. He could not. Every man there understood the rule that had just been broken. This was not an outside hit. This was not the police. This was not the Mafia. This was internal. And in Bumpy Johnson's Harlem, betrayal was worse than death. Bumpy finally spoke, his voice low, controlled, carrying just enough to cut through the shock. "Who told you to pull that trigger?" No one answered. The silence was heavier than the gunshot had been, because everyone there knew what that question really meant. It wasn't about permission. It was about loyalty, about who had decided, without warning, without approval, to change the rules that kept Harlem from tearing itself apart. Bumpy looked down again at the body, then slowly lifted his gaze to the faces around him. Men who had sworn to stand with him. Men who had eaten at his table, used his name for protection, borrowed against his reputation. In that moment, the legend understood something terrible and irreversible. Harlem had entered a new era, and trust would never be the same. Before that night, Ellsworth, Bumpy, Johnson's world had been built on a fragile but fiercely enforced code. Respect, discipline, and loyalty. By the early 1960s, Bumpy Johnson was not just a crime boss. He was Harlem's unofficial governor. His name carried weight in barbershops, churches, back rooms, and police precincts alike. He had survived prison, rivals, and the Mafia's long shadow, not by brute chaos, but by control. Bumpy ruled through balance. He understood something most men with power never did. Harlem was watching. Every move he made rippled through the community. If he allowed reckless violence, Harlem paid the price. If he let outsiders humiliate his people, Harlem lost dignity. And if he tolerated betrayal, everything he built would collapse from the inside. That was why his circle was small. Trusted lieutenants handled numbers, clubs, and collections. Runners moved quietly through familiar streets. Messages traveled by word of mouth, not paper. Loyalty was rewarded with protection. Disloyalty was handled swiftly, but cleanly, quietly. Because chaos invited attention, and attention invited police, politicians, and worse, the Mafia families who still believed Harlem was theirs to manipulate. Bumpy had spent decades proving them wrong. He negotiated with Italian bosses as an equal, not a servant. He funded local businesses, helped families when landlords or cops crossed the line, and enforced order where the city had abandoned it. In return, Harlem protected him. Doors stayed closed, names stayed unspoken. Trust was the currency that made it all work, and the man who lay dead on 135th Street had been one of its keepers. His name didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what his death represented. He had been close enough to know Bumpy's routines, close enough to hear whispers, close enough to become a liability, or a temptation. Rumors had been circulating for weeks, quiet ones, Whispers about money missing, about side conversations with men who didn't belong, about a police captain from downtown suddenly knowing too much about Harlem's internal business. Bumpy had heard them all. And he had done what he always did. Waited. Because Bumpy Johnson did not react to rumors. He measured them, tested them, let men reveal themselves through patience. He believed loyalty, real loyalty, revealed itself under pressure. But the shot on 135th Street proved something else entirely. Someone had decided to act first. Someone had decided Bumpy's permission was no longer required. And that decision threatened more than Bumpy's authority. It threatened the stability of Harlem itself. Because if men inside his circle felt free to kill without sanction, then every alliance, every agreement, every fragile peace was meaningless. The police would sense blood, rivals would smell weakness, and Harlem would suffer for it. Bumpy understood this before anyone else did. That was why he didn't shout, why he didn't strike the shooter where he stood, why he didn't let rage take control. Instead, he memorized faces. He listened to breathing. He watched who looked afraid and who looked relieved. Because the real enemy had not fired the gun. The real enemy was the man who believed trust no longer mattered in Bumpy Johnson's Harlem. And as squad cars began to wail in the distance, Bumpy finally turned away from the body. His expression was calm. Too calm. Those who knew him best felt a chill deeper than the winter air. Because when Bumpy Johnson went quiet like that, it meant judgment was coming. Not reckless, not public, but final. Harlem had just learned a painful truth. The shot hadn't just killed a man. It had ended an era, and whatever came next would demand justice. By sunrise, Harlem knew something had gone wrong. It wasn't announced. No headlines screamed it. No sirens lingered longer than usual. But the streets felt different, like a neighborhood waking up after a bad dream it couldn't quite remember, only feel in its bones. Store owners opened late. Runners moved slower. Men who usually laughed too loud in back rooms spoke in hushed tones. The body from 135th Street had been removed before dawn, but the stain remained, dark, stubborn, impossible to scrub away. Blood had a way of speaking. Bumpy Johnson spent that morning alone. He sat in his apartment, coat still on, hat resting untouched on the table beside him. The city noise drifted in through a cracked window, buses hissing, shoes scraping pavement, a vendor calling out the price of fruit. Life going on, unaware of how close it stood to the edge. On the table lay three things: a cup of untouched coffee, a folded piece of paper with names written in pencil, and a silence thick enough to choke on. Bumpy reread the list, slowly. Every name belonged to someone who had been present the night before. Men he had trusted with pieces of his world. Men whose loyalty had once been unquestioned. He did not rush. He did not speculate aloud. He remembered something an old convict had told him years earlier in Dannemora. Betrayal ain't loud, Bumpy. It whispers. You gotta listen close. The whisper had become a gunshot. By mid-morning, the first visitor arrived. He came alone, unannounced, confident enough to knock without fear. That confidence alone narrowed Bumpy's eyes. The man was known as Walter Slim Green, one of Bumpy's senior lieutenants. Clean dresser, calm talker. The kind of man police liked because he looked respectable enough to underestimate. Slim had handled numbers operations across several blocks, quietly, efficiently, and without complaint. Until recently. Slim took off his hat when he entered, eyes flicking briefly to the untouched coffee, then to the paper on the table. He smiled nervously. "Rough night," he said. Bumpy didn't return the smile. "Sit," Bumpy replied. Slim obeyed. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The silence wasn't hostile, it was evaluative. Bumpy studied Slim's posture, the way his fingers tapped once against his knee before stopping. A tell, maybe. Or maybe nerves finally catching up. Slim cleared his throat. "Word is police are asking questions already." "Police always ask questions," Bumpy said calmly. Difference is, who's answering? Slim nodded quickly. Ain't gonna be us. Bumpy's eyes lifted. You sure about that? The question landed heavier than it sounded. Slim shifted slightly in his chair. That shooting, Slim said carefully, it wasn't sanctioned. Everybody knows that. Whoever ordered it, whoever benefited from it, Bumpy corrected. Slim paused. That pause was everything. Bumpy leaned back, folding his hands. Tell me something, Slim. When a man pulls a trigger without permission, what does that tell you? Slim chose his words like stepping stones across a river. It tells me he was scared, or desperate, or protected, Bumpy said. Slim's jaw tightened. Bumpy continued, voice even. Men don't break rules unless they believe someone stronger will shield them from consequences. So the question ain't who fired the gun. It's who convinced him he'd live after. Slim swallowed. You think there's a shield? I know there is. Silence again. Slim finally spoke. There's talk, he said. Downtown. A captain. Irish. New to the precinct. He's been leaning on people, offering deals. Protection. Protection from who? Bumpy asked. Slim hesitated. From you. That was the moment the air changed. Bumpy did not react outwardly, but something hardened behind his eyes. He had dealt with racist cops, crooked cops, violent cops. But a police captain bold enough to undermine Harlem's internal order directly, that was escalation. And what do these deals cost? Bumpy asked. Slim looked away. Information. Names. Routes. Who answers to who? Trust, Bumpy thought. Slim stood quickly. I just came to warn you. I'm loyal. Always have been. Bumpy stood too. He walked to the window and looked out at Harlem stretching awake beneath him. Then he spoke without turning. Loyalty ain't what a man says when he's scared. It's what he does when nobody's watching. Slim said nothing. Bumpy finally faced him. You did right coming here. But understand this. Every man connected to that shot is already standing on borrowed time. And borrowed time always comes due. Slim nodded, sweat beating at his hairline. He left without another word. By afternoon, the whispers grew louder. One of the dead man's associates vanished. A numbers runner skipped town. A club owner refused to open his back room to anyone without clearance. The city was reacting instinctively, like an animal sensing a storm. And then the real challenge arrived. A message, not delivered by street runner but by badge. 2 detectives showed up at one of Bumpy's fronts, polite smiles stretched thin, asking for a friendly conversation. They mentioned the shooting, mentioned names that should have stayed buried, mentioned protection deals offered downtown. The message was clear. Someone inside Bumpy's world was already talking. That night, Bumpy called a meeting. Not everyone, just the core. Men who had survived long enough to understand what this summons meant. They gathered in a back room above a closed restaurant, the air thick with cigarette smoke and unspoken fear. Bumpy entered last. He stood at the head of the table, eyes moving slowly from face to face. No speeches, no accusations, just one sentence. Trust has been broken. Every man felt it land. Bumpy continued. Until I know exactly where, nobody moves without my word. No collections, no side meetings, no deals with anyone wearing a badge or a borrowed smile. One man shifted uncomfortably. Another nodded too quickly. Bumpy noticed everything. This ain't punishment, he said. This is containment. He leaned forward slightly. Because whoever thought they could act without me just declared war on the only thing keeping this neighborhood standing. No one argued. They all understood the stakes now. This wasn't about a single death anymore. This was about whether Bumpy Johnson still controlled Harlem, or whether fear and betrayal would finish what rivals never could. And somewhere downtown, a police captain was smiling, convinced the first crack had already become a fracture. He was wrong. Because Bumpy Johnson was done listening to whispers. Now, he was ready to answer them. The first rule Bumpy Johnson enforced after the shooting was silence. No calls after dark, No names spoken outside trusted rooms. No movement without purpose. To outsiders, Harlem looked calm, almost peaceful. But beneath that calm ran a current of unease so sharp it cut. Men who once moved freely now checked corners twice. Conversations ended the moment unfamiliar footsteps approached. Even laughter sounded rehearsed, because everyone understood the same truth. When Bumpy Johnson stopped talking, it meant he was listening harder than ever. He began with the dead man's shadow. Every man left behind casts one. Debts unpaid, favors owed, grudges buried just beneath the surface. Bumpy quietly ordered those shadows traced. Who benefited from the man's death? Who lost? Who suddenly felt lighter, freer, less afraid? The answers didn't arrive all at once. They never did. They came in fragments. A bartender mentioning a stranger buying drinks and asking questions. A numbers runner admitting a cop had known his nickname. A woman from the block saying she'd seen the shooter arguing with someone in a parked car days earlier. A car registered to the city. Bumpy didn't smile. He didn't curse. He simply marked time. Then came confirmation. Late one evening, a trusted courier named Isaiah slipped into Bumpy's apartment without knocking. His face was pale, his voice barely steady. "They're meeting," Isaiah said. "Tomorrow night, downtown. The captain, and one of ours." Bumpy looked up slowly. "Which one?" Isaiah hesitated. "Slim." The name settled like a weight. Walter Slim Green, polished, patient, always careful to look clean. The man who had come warning Bumpy of police protection deals. The man who had left claiming loyalty. Bumpy closed his eyes for just a moment. This was how betrayal usually worked. Not loud, not dramatic. Wrapped in concern. Delivered with half-truths and a straight face. "Where?" Bumpy asked. "A diner off Lexington. Private room in the back. They've used it before." "Before?" Bumpy repeated. Isaiah nodded. "Not with you. With the police." That was the final piece. Slim wasn't reacting to chaos. He had been preparing for it. Bumpy dismissed Isaiah and sat alone in the dim light, considering the shape of the thing in front of him. This wasn't just about one lieutenant turning informant. This was about authority, who men believed could protect them when the pressure came. The police captain had offered shelter. Slim had believed him. That belief was dangerous. Because if one lieutenant could defect without consequence, others would follow. Harlem didn't collapse from attacks. It collapsed from doubt. Bumpy stood and put on his coat. He didn't order Slim killed. He didn't send a message. Instead, he decided to watch. The next night, rain slicked the streets downtown, turning neon signs into blurred reflections on black pavement. The diner was half empty, the kind of place where nobody looked twice at quiet men in dark coats. From across the street, Bumpy sat in the back seat of a parked car, watching through rain-streaked glass. Slim arrived first. He entered alone, shoulders tense, eyes scanning. A man who knew he was walking a line. 10 minutes later, a city sedan pulled up. The driver stayed inside. The passenger stepped out. Police Captain Thomas Rourke. Rourke was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face permanently set in practiced authority. He wore his badge like armor, coat open just enough to remind the world who he was. He didn't look around when he entered the diner. Men like him rarely did. Bumpy watched them take the back room. He listened, not with ears, but with memory. This was the kind of man Rourke was. Confident, ambitious, convinced Harlem was a machine that could be dismantled piece by piece. He didn't hate Bumpy Johnson. He didn't need to. He saw him as a problem to be solved, not a man to be respected. Inside the diner, Slim talked, and talked, and talked. Names, territories, timelines. In exchange, Rourke promised protection, reduced sentences, quiet files. A future where Slim wouldn't have to look over his shoulder anymore. Slim wanted out. Bumpy understood that desire better than anyone. But wanting out didn't give a man the right to burn the house down on his way through the door. After an hour, the meeting ended. Slim left first, face pale, hands shaking slightly as he lit a cigarette in the rain. Rourke followed, unbothered, confident, already filing the night away as a victory. Bumpy remained in the car until both were gone. He didn't feel anger. He felt clarity. The next phase began immediately. By morning, Slim noticed the change. His usual contacts didn't answer. Runners avoided him. A door that had always been open was suddenly locked. Even the bartender who used to greet him by name barely nodded. Isolation was the first consequence. Slim went to Rourke, uneasy. Rourke reassured him, told him Bumpy was finished, told him the city would move in soon, that the structure would collapse. But Harlem didn't collapse. It tightened. Bumpy began meeting people Slim thought were loyal to him, quietly, respectfully. One by one, they chose the side that had fed them, protected them, and kept the streets stable. Slim's information started going stale, then dangerous. Because when police raids came up empty, Rourke's confidence cracked. Pressure from his superiors mounted. And suddenly, Slim wasn't an asset, he was a liability. The captain stopped returning calls. Slim panicked, and panic made men sloppy. The night Slim finally tried to reach Bumpy directly, he realized too late that he had no safe path left. Every bridge behind him was burned. Every promise ahead of him had been a lie. Meanwhile, Bumpy Johnson prepared the confrontation. Not in the street, not with bullets, but with something far more devastating. Truth. Because when betrayal was exposed under the right light, it didn't just punish the traitor. It restored the order they thought they had escaped. And soon, both Slim and Captain Rourke would learn the same lesson. Protection built on betrayal never lasts. The meeting was set for a reason. Bumpy Johnson did not believe in coincidences, only opportunities disguised as them. When word reached Captain Thomas Rourke that Bumpy was willing to talk, the captain took it as confirmation of what he already believed, that Harlem was folding, that pressure worked, that legends aged into liabilities. Rourke chose the location himself, a municipal building conference room just off Center Street, neutral ground, cameras in the hall, uniforms within shouting distance. A place where he believed power belonged to the badge. Bumpy arrived 10 minutes early. He wore a dark overcoat, hat pulled low, hands empty. No entourage, no visible protection. Just a man walking calmly into a space designed to intimidate him. The officers at the front desk stiffened when they saw him. One reached for a phone. Another cleared his throat. Bumpy didn't acknowledge them. He walked as if he had every right to be there. Inside the conference room, Captain Rourke waited with two detectives. Files were stacked neatly on the table. Arrests, photos, typed statements. The tools of institutional pressure. Rourke smiled when Bumpy entered. "Mr. Johnson," he said. "Appreciate you coming in." Bumpy took a seat without being offered one. He removed his hat and placed it on the table, careful, deliberate. "You asked for a conversation," Bumpy said. "I'm here." Rourke leaned back. "I figured it was time. Things are changing in Harlem." "Change ain't new," Bumpy replied. "Disrespect is." The detective shifted. Rourke smirked. "You think this is disrespect? I think this is reality catching up with you." Bumpy's eyes moved to the files. "You always stack paper like that when you're nervous?" Rourke's smile thinned. "I stack paper when I have leverage." Bumpy nodded slowly. "Then you should know what you're holding." Rourke opened a folder and slid a photograph across the table. Slim Green entering the diner. "Your lieutenant's been very helpful," Rourke said. "He understands cooperation." Bumpy studied the photo. "He understands fear." "Same thing in my experience," Rourke replied. Bumpy looked up. "Then your experience is shallow." Silence pressed in. Rourke leaned forward. "Let's stop pretending. You've lost control. Your people are talking. And the longer you fight it, the worse it gets. I can make this easy or very public." Bumpy folded his hands. "You ever wonder why Harlem didn't burn last night?" Rourke blinked. "What?" "You sent cars. You leaned on doors. You rattled cages. In another time, that would have sparked riots. But nothing happened. Rourke scoffed. Because they're scared. No, Bumpy said calmly. Because I told them not to. The words landed hard. Rourke laughed once, sharp. You think you still give orders? Bumpy reached into his coat slowly. The detectives tensed, hands moving toward holsters. Bumpy placed an envelope on the table. Relax, he said. If I wanted violence, you wouldn't be part of the conversation. Rourke opened the envelope. Inside were copies of statements. Signed, dated, names redacted but unmistakable. Evidence of police bribery, protection deals, payments funneled through intermediaries. Rourke's face changed. What is this? He demanded. Your career, Bumpy replied. The detectives exchanged looks. You think this scares me? Rourke said. Where'd you even get? From men who trusted you, Bumpy interrupted. The same way Slim trusted you. Rourke slammed the file shut. This is extortion. This is balance, Bumpy said. You disrupted it. Rourke stood. You don't walk out of here. Bumpy stood with him. Watch me. The door opened. A uniformed officer stepped in, pale. Captain, Internal Affairs is downstairs. They're asking for you. The room froze. Rourke stared at Bumpy. You did this. Bumpy met his gaze. You did this when you forgot Harlem ain't yours to carve up. Rourke turned to the detectives. Get him out. No one moved. The weight of the moment pressed down on them all. Authority shifted, not by force, but by exposure. Bumpy picked up his hat. You wanted trust broken, he said. Now you get to live without it. As he turned to leave, Rourke shouted, What about Slim? Bumpy paused at the door. He already answered for himself, Bumpy said. You just didn't know it yet. Outside, the building hummed with quiet chaos, whispers, phones ringing, doors closing. By nightfall, Captain Rourke was suspended pending investigation, and Slim Green was missing. Not hidden, not protected, just gone. Harlem heard the news the way it always did, not through papers, but through tone, through posture, through the way men walked a little straighter the next day. Bumpy Johnson hadn't fired a shot, but he had ended something far more dangerous. The belief that betrayal paid better than loyalty. Justice in Harlem never arrived with sirens. It came quietly, carried on lowered voices and careful glances. By the time Captain Thomas Rourke's suspension made its way from police headquarters to the streets, most of the neighborhood already knew. Not the details, but the outcome. The balance had been restored. Bumpy Johnson did not celebrate. He walked Harlem that morning the same way he always had, measured steps, eyes forward, greeting shopkeepers with a nod. Men stepped aside to let him pass, not out of fear, but recognition. The kind reserved for someone who had protected the house when the walls started cracking. The consequences rippled outward. Police pressure eased, not because corruption vanished, but because uncertainty replaced confidence. Rourke's replacement kept things procedural, cautious, unwilling to push without airtight justification. Raids stopped coming up empty. Informants stopped being reckless. And inside Bumpy's organization, order reasserted itself. Meetings resumed, but differently now. Where once trust had been assumed, it was now earned again in pieces. Routes were reorganized. Information was compartmentalized. Men who spoke too freely found themselves quietly sidelined. This wasn't paranoia. It was survival. Bumpy addressed his inner circle 3 nights later, in the same back room where he had declared trust broken. The mood was somber. No smoke, no jokes. Slim Green's chair remained empty. Bumpy stood at the head of the table. What happened, he said, wasn't about ambition. It was about impatience. No one interrupted. Men think shortcuts lead to freedom. They don't. They lead to dependence. First on the police, then on fear. He let that sink in. I won't pretend nothing changed. It did. But understand this. Harlem stands today because we corrected it ourselves. A man near the end of the table asked carefully, "What about Slim?" Bumpy's eyes hardened, not with anger, but finality. "His debt was collected," Bumpy said. "No spectacle, no message written in blood, just consequence." No further explanation was needed. Outside the room, Harlem adjusted. The man who had pulled the trigger on 135th Street was found weeks later in another state, arrested on unrelated charges. He never spoke publicly about what had driven him to fire. He didn't have to. Everyone already knew. Fear backed by false protection had convinced him the rules no longer applied. That belief had cost him everything. As for Slim Green, rumors circulated, but none were confirmed. Some said he tried to run. Others said he tried to negotiate. The truth mattered less than the lesson. Betrayal erased you. Not dramatically, not instantly, but completely. The streets noticed. So did the Mafia. Italian bosses who had once tested Bumpy's limits quietly recalibrated. A man who could dismantle a police captain without violence was not a man to provoke lightly. Negotiations resumed on equal footing. Bumpy Johnson remained what he had always been, uncomfortable for everyone who wanted control without accountability. And Harlem respected that. In the weeks that followed, something subtle but powerful happened. Storefronts stayed open later. Arguments ended faster. Violence dipped, not because men were afraid, but because the consequences were clear and consistent. Justice had been delivered without spectacle, and that, in Harlem, carried weight. Bumpy sat alone one evening in his apartment, jazz low on the radio, watching dusk settle over the streets. He thought about the shot, the sound that had broken trust. He didn't regret how he responded, but he understood the cost. Leadership meant accepting that even loyalty had an expiration date if left unguarded, that every system needed reinforcement, that respect, once shaken, had to be rebuilt brick by brick. He poured a drink he didn't finish. Outside, a group of kids laughed on the corner. A man swept his stoop. Life continued. That was the point. Harlem had survived another test, and it had done so without losing itself. Years later, men would still talk about that winter in Harlem. Not loudly, not with exaggeration. They spoke about it the way people speak about storms that almost took the house but didn't. Measured, respectful, with an understanding of how close everything had come to collapsing. They called it the night trust died, and they called what followed the reason Harlem survived. Bumpy Johnson never corrected them. He understood legacy wasn't something you claimed. It was something other people decided when the danger had passed and the dust had settled. What set that moment apart from all the others in Bumpy's long career wasn't the absence of violence. It was the precision of restraint. In a world that expected bullets, he had used exposure. Where rivals expected chaos, he had imposed order. And Harlem remembered. Older men told younger ones the lesson plainly. Power wasn't about how fast you struck. It was about knowing when not to. They spoke of how Bumpy had dismantled a police captain without bloodshed, how betrayal had been neutralized without turning the streets into a battlefield. That balance mattered, because Harlem had seen enough blood to last a lifetime. In the broader history of the city, Captain Rourke became a footnote, another ambitious officer undone by his own shortcuts. Internal affairs dragged the investigation out quietly, and though convictions were scarce, his career never recovered. He was transferred, then retired early, his name spoken with caution in precincts that once admired him. He never returned to Harlem. Bumpy Johnson did, not as a conqueror, but as a constant. The community understood what had been defended that year. It wasn't criminal territory. It was dignity. The right to solve internal problems without outsiders exploiting weakness. The belief that order, even unofficial order, was better than chaos imposed from outside. Church leaders who publicly condemned crime privately acknowledged the stability. Business owners appreciated predictability. Even police on the street level adapted, recognizing the invisible lines that kept peace. That was Bumpy's real power. He didn't erase crime. He contained it. Historians would later struggle with that contradiction. How a man operating outside the law could be a stabilizing force. But Harlem didn't struggle with it at all. They lived it. The shot that ended trust had forced Bumpy to evolve. After that winter, his structure changed permanently. No single lieutenant held too much information. Decisions were documented mentally, not verbally. Trust became earned daily, not assumed over years. Some called it paranoia. Bumpy called it responsibility. Because legends didn't just survive attacks, they learned from them. As the years passed and his health declined, younger figures rose, eager, impatient, convinced they could move faster, louder, harder. Some failed. Some vanished. Some learned. But all of them measured themselves against the same standard. What would Bumpy do? That question lingered in Harlem long after his voice grew quieter. And when he finally died, the stories didn't focus on numbers or rackets or prisons. They focused on moments like that winter. Moments when chaos was invited and refused. The shot that ended trust had not ended his rule. It had refined it. Because legends aren't defined by the crises they face, but by the order they restore when everything is on the verge of breaking apart. This wasn't just about a gunshot on a cold Harlem night. It was about a line being crossed, and a legend deciding whether that line would erase everything he'd built or redefine it. The shot that ended trust in Bumpy Johnson's world did something most enemies never could. It exposed the most dangerous weakness of all. Not violence, not the police, not rival power, but the belief that loyalty could be replaced by fear and shortcuts. Bumpy understood something that history keeps proving true. Power held by intimidation collapses the moment a better offer comes along. Power held by trust survives storms. When Betrayal tried to hollow out Harlem from the inside, he didn't answer with chaos. He answered with control, with patience, with a justice that didn't need applause to be effective. That choice mattered, because Harlem didn't need another war. It needed stability. It needed someone who understood that leadership wasn't about how loudly you struck back, but about how carefully you protected the balance when everything pushed toward collapse. The police captain learned that authority without respect is fragile. The traitor learned that protection bought with betrayal expires fast. And Harlem learned, once again, that legends aren't loud by accident. They're quiet on purpose. Bumpy Johnson didn't just survive the moment trust died in his world. He rebuilt what came after it. And in doing so, he left Harlem something far more valuable than fear. He left it order. Because sometimes, the greatest act of power isn't pulling the trigger. It's knowing exactly when not to.